Not hearing anything. Oh, it's waiting.
Okay, this is a very quick audio test, which will probably come through in about 5 minutes, based on what's just happened there. And until that comes through, I'm just going to mute this again.
Very low. I don't know whether it's the volume. No, it's this volume here actually.
Ah, yes.
It is a little low still.
Okay, this is a second audio test. If anybody would like to comment in the comments, let me know if they can actually hear anything, that'd be grand.
It is better.
Is it? Is it clear?
Near the motorbikes, right? So
Really typical. So it's got to be coming through the through the road.
you try marking that just to make sure it's the right microphone.
Microphone is on. Oh, it's a different Richard Summers. That's confusing. Right. Right, we now have volume. I think there's a bit of a delay, so we'll just have to give it another 20 seconds to see if there's any sound coming through. And then we'll just get started. So as soon as I got the thumbs up. In the meantime, hello to Richard, who's watching from Whitcliffe down in Ludlow, Sue in Hereford, and Tina's also watching. So thanks everybody for joining in. Okay, well it looks like I've got some volume, so I will start the talk off now. I can see we've got a few people in, so we've got 65 people viewing now, so welcome everybody that's joined us for the first Shropshire Wildlife Trust live YouTube talk, and tonight's talk is with me, Stuart, on Shropshire pine martens. You'll have to bear with us, as I mentioned, it is our first talk live on YouTube. Although it's fully tested, I'm sure it'll all go swimmingly well, but we'll just keep an eye out for glitches. And if anybody would like to comment as I'm talking as well, I can read the comments, and I'll try to keep track of any issues that people report on the live chat as well. So without further ado, what I'm going to do, you'll be able to see me hopefully pop up any minute now. There is a bit of a delay, as I mentioned, so you will hopefully be presented very shortly with myself and a picture of a pine marten. So we'll just wait to get onto that. But just to give you a bit of background, my job role is Communications Officer at Shropshire Wildlife Trust, but I've also got a bit of a thing for mammals and wildlife of the elusive kind. So what I'm going to be doing tonight is talking to you a little bit about the pine martens, my beloved pine martens, and we'll also be talking about the future of pine martens in Shropshire, because it's been a really interesting few years. Now, hopefully you can all see me, so what I'm going to do is get on with the presentation. And I just wanted to start by introducing any of you that don't live in Shropshire to Shropshire. It's a little known county, but a really beautiful county. More people should probably come, but I also don't want to encourage too many people because I don't want it to get too busy. But as you can see, we're right down on the border with Wales. Landlocked county surrounded by counties of Staffordshire, Cheshire and Worcestershire and Herefordshire to the south. And we've got a variety of really nice landscapes. So we've got the meres and mosses up in the north, and the wetlands, and of course Shropshire is known for its lovely area of outstanding natural beauty, so the Shropshire Hills, and that's somewhere that I like to spend a lot of my time. So pine martens I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, but one interesting point to make now is that I used to be obsessed with pine martens prior to this project or kicking off, and I've been for well over 20 years now. But I used to spend a lot of time going up to Scotland to see pine martens, and I never envisaged that I'd find Shropshire pine martens. And being a Shropshire born and bred lad, it was great to be able to look for one of my favourite animals in Shropshire, but of course I never expected to find them. But what you may also it's worth pointing out as well that we're not going to be talking about this kind of marten. So this is a house marten, the flying marten, spelt totally differently. It's spelt with an I and not an E, as in the pine marten. So we're not going to be talking about birds tonight. We're going to be talking about the large mammals. And pine martens are much bigger than people realise, actually. So we're talking about an animal between 60 and 90 centimetres in length from tip of the nose to tip of the tail. They've got that large bushy tail, which is a good distinguishing feature if you are looking out for them. And they've also got a cream throat bib. So overall the fur is chocolatey brown, but they've also got that really distinguishable mark in the cream throat bib, we call it. And I'll talk a bit more about throat bibs a little bit later. So they're also they're members of the mustelid family. So for anybody that's not familiar with the mustelid family, that's a great word to remember. The mustelids are the polecats, otters, badgers, stoats, and the tenacious weasel. So the weasel being the smallest of our native mustelids in the UK. We've also got American mink, which are a member of the same family, but of course they've been released into the countryside in the UK, so they're a non-native member. Now going back to pine martens specifically, they're very elusive. So one of the reasons that I'm so attracted to looking for mammals is because it's a bit of a challenge. It's great also to go bird watching. I love going to nature reserves to do a bit of bird watching and photography, but there's nothing like doing mammal tracking and almost getting your detective skills, putting them to the test. And we're basically looking for signs of these things a lot of the time, so we don't see the mammals themselves. And it's great to know that there's loads of wildlife out there that's completely avoiding human eye contact, pretty much their whole existence. So pine martens are really quite elusive, as I mentioned. They're trying to avoid humans because we're scary. They're largely arboreal, so they spend a lot of their time tucked away in treetops, really good at climbing, and they've got semi-retractable claws which they use for gripping onto trees, and they can run vertically just as quick as they can on the flat. Now they're also difficult to spot because they're active when there's pretty low light levels, so they're crepuscular, which means they're active at dawn and dusk. And they mate. Generally, the males are solitary, but they will pair up towards late summer and early autumn. Mating occurs, but the youngsters aren't born until the following spring, and that gives the youngsters a good few, hopefully dry and warm months to it when there's plenty of food around for them to get fed up and ready for the following winter. Average brood size is 4 kits, but it's very rare that all of those will survive, but of course it depends on how much food there is about for them, and it depends on the predators. Now, I've already said how difficult they are to spot. Even where there's a lot of pine martens, you're not guaranteed to see them, but they live in very, very low density. So a single male territory could be 20 kilometres square, so we're talking about an animal the size of a domestic house cat that can climb trees. Generally, your chances of seeing them in a woodland are pretty limited. And females are slightly smaller in size, but also they're covering slightly smaller areas, but you can see still quite a considerable amount of woodland for us to go out looking for them. So never a guarantee of seeing these martens. And one of the reasons that I was first completely spellbound by the pine marten was my first encounter when I just fleetingly saw one run across the road during a family holiday in the 80s. Just that probably 2 or 3 seconds of seeing this animal run across, it looked like such an exotic animal that I had no idea that we've got such incredible wildlife. So it was almost the main reason I became attracted or interested in wildlife in Britain, because of course most of the nature programs we used to watch was all about the the wildlife in exotic and tropical countries. But then lo and behold, it turns out that we've got some pretty spectacular wildlife in the UK too. Now, they were quite common prior to the spread of humans across the UK, so they were really common after the last ice age. But the decline really began as more woodland was chopped down and humans started to have that huge impact on the landscape of the British Isles. So I'll talk a little bit about the other reasons for the decline. Sorry, I was just distracted temporarily by the comments coming in, but that's nothing to stress about at the moment. So that their decline was triggered by loss of habitat, hunting for subsistence, going back thousands of years, but also their fur was highly sought after. So a pine marten pelt was a highly sought after commodity. This is a really warm, great piece of clothing, but also a great indicator of people's social status. So if during medieval times you were lucky enough to be wandering around with a coat made of pine marten pelts, it was a pretty good sign that you were doing okay in life. Sadly for the pine martens, of course, they were being hunted in their thousands to make these fashionable coats for us to all wear. Going into the Victorian era, the 19th century, there was a huge rise in the shooting sports, pheasant shooting, and huge shooting estates started to become managed for the rearing and release of things like pheasants and partridges. And of course, because of that, the pine martens, being carnivores, they're opportunists, but they will take something that basically pops along as an easy meal. So if they come across a pheasant, they may have a good go at it. Because of that, they were hunted again by the gamekeepers, and the gamekeepers kept quite a good record of the numbers of pine martens that they used to trap and shoot, because of course they would get paid quite a good bounty for that when they took those game bags back to the landowner. And it was actually one of those records which made it into the 1893 Flora and Fauna of Shropshire, and that was a gamekeeper record of a shot pine marten down on a hunting estate near Ludlow. Prior to that, there'd actually been quite a few other records of pine martens being trapped and shot in Shropshire woodland, but then it all seemed to stop at that point in 1893. So it was generally assumed that pine martens had become extinct at that point in time. But there was anecdotal evidence of pine martens cropping up every so often. So looking back through some of the archives, we've got records in local magazines in Shropshire back in the 1980s. So that's a fairly reliable sighting back from 1987. And then in 1911, there were references to pine martens in the Guardian, even the Daily Mail's Nature Notes. And so people were reporting still seeing pine martens back as far up to 1911. Even in the 1960s, further afield from Shropshire, but over the other side of the West Midlands in Coventry, around the Smethwick area and around Stafford, there were records too. So there were possibly still pine martens around in the Cannock Chase area right up to the 1960s and possibly beyond, but of course very difficult to prove these things now. Now, I've mentioned that I never really expected there to be pine martens in Shropshire, and that was very much the case in 2009 when I became involved with Shropshire Mammal Group. Looking at some of the interesting records that the group made, the group is basically compiling records of where all the mammal activity is in Shropshire, and I was surprised to see that amongst all the badgers, the weasels, grey squirrel records that were being sent in, there were also a handful of pine marten records which completely captivated me. So of course then I started to plot those records from the grid references onto a map, and it seemed very interesting that these pine marten records, when you put them onto a map, they all seemed to coincide with some nice, pretty decent sized bits of forest down in South Shropshire. And it was quite surprising that all of those were being made by separate people that didn't know each other. And this was all prior to 2009. They were all reporting seeing what they said was pine martens, and they were all within the same area. So with that in mind, I ran a an appeal, actually a couple of appeals. The second one was in 2011 to ask people to send in their records or their sightings of pine martens, just to give people the benefit of the doubt, because of course we'd assumed that pine martens were extinct not only in Shropshire but pretty much across most of England. And at that point there were probably just a handful of pine martens remaining in Wales, but not in viable numbers. So in 2015 there were plans by Vincent Wildlife Trust to release some translocated pine martens to enhance the woodlands of West Wales by getting pine martens from Scotland, where there's abundant numbers of pine martens. And that was in about August 2015. Now, in the summer of 2015, I was watching the Vincent Wildlife Trust plans and getting quite excited about the prospect of there definitely being pine martens being released within 100 miles of where I lived. But I'd pretty much given up any kind of hope of finding pine martens myself. One of the reasons for that is because I'd been putting camera traps out as well. So whenever I investigated a sighting, if people phoned up to say they'd seen a pine marten or sent me an email, I'd then go to the site and put a camera trap out. And what would happen quite regularly is, you may or may not be able to see this, we'll soon find out. It turned out to be domesticated cats that were actually predating rabbits and things in people's gardens and leaving their disemboweled remains spread across the lawn. Never pine martens though, but we were getting things like mink and polecats show up. I'll probably do another talk on camera traps at some point, but just to touch briefly on what I was doing with the camera traps. Back in 2015 I only had 4 or 5 cameras, and I tended to put them quite low down to the ground just so that nobody could actually see them. But the hope was that if I set them on video low to the ground, if any animals came in like pine marten size, I should get good video footage of their features, so I'd be able to identify the individuals. So I'd got 4 or 5 out, but of course I wasn't recording pine martens. There were people laughing at me in the office because I was dedicating so much time to travelling around the county speaking to people, wasting hours of my time and quite a lot of petrol, I'm ashamed to say. And by July I'd pretty much assumed that there probably weren't any pine martens in Shropshire, it all being cases of mistaken identity. That was until one Monday morning I came to work and I received an email from a chap called Dave Pearce, who had said in his email, "Can you just check the animal in the photograph attached?" And I had to check just to see who Dave Pearce was, just to make sure it wasn't a joke, because when I opened the photo, of course the photograph showed a very clear, well I say very clear, it was a good enough image for me to identify that we got a pine marten on camera trap. But of course I didn't believe that Dave had seen this pine marten down in South Shropshire. So I made him match up every tree along that trail so that I could basically match the photo to the location. And even then I'd started to think it's probably pulling my leg. It's probably just taken a taxidermy or a stuffed pine marten and dragged it through the woodland. So after all the years of letdown, I was still fairly cynical at this point. But I'd got my camera trap, so I was able with Dave to have a look through the woodland and deploy camera traps in the areas that Dave thought the pine marten may have headed to. And 2 weeks later I returned to the site, and just 10 days after pine marten Dave had seen his pine marten and got those photos, we'd got the first daytime clips, well not just the first daytime clips, but actually the first clips of pine martens on video in Shropshire, but then probably the first pine marten footage on camera trap in England. And it was incredibly exciting, as you can imagine. But pine martens don't like to be too predictable, so we had assumed that the martens would be around for a bit, or that this marten may have just passed through and wouldn't show up again. But you can imagine my excitement when a few more days later I ventured back to check the camera traps and we'd got a marten still hanging around the same woodland. So not clips every day, but there were at least clips happening every so often. We've talked about the martens inhabiting huge areas. There's a very good chance that this was a marten living in a huge territory and just happened to be going past those camera traps about every week. And of course, we were very excited about it. I got a little bit overexcited about it, to be fair. But it was great for our coverage, so it really put Shropshire on the map for a while. So we got mentions in the local papers, and it was really big news locally. But then really good to see that there was the national interest and even international interest. So I was shocked to receive emails asking for quotes from places as far afield as California, and even over in Asia for little quotes for newspaper articles. So it really did get out there thanks to the power of the internet. But also interestingly, it ended up in some bizarre places like Horticulture Week, which highlighted to me that it wasn't just really me and some of my geeky conservation friends that were interested in pine martens and being around. There seems to be a really big wide interest, people all walks of life showing up. And because of that, we ended up doing some bits and pieces with Midlands Today, which was great stuff, because then that was getting more people aware of the fact that we've got pine martens around. But of course, it's just a great way of explaining to people what a pine marten is. So when we get this camera trap footage, as we got after doing BBC Midlands Today, that was the first time that people had even seen pine martens in any kind of footage whatsoever. So I didn't realise how few people prior to this had no idea what a pine marten was, but they were obviously quite interested. And with that, we couldn't just leave it there. So after all that toil, 7 years of searching pretty much, I thought, well, we know they're here, but we can't just leave it at that and just let them be or possibly even die out. What I wanted to do is find out how many there were, and just to have a look at their geographic range, to see how far spread they might be in Shropshire, and whether or not they may even be spread into surrounding counties too. And I wanted to raise a bit more awareness of them locally, and I also wanted to find out where they were from. Now, this was a particularly challenging aspect of the work, and I'll just touch on this now. But what I really needed to do, which it sounds more and more far-fetched the more the time goes on, and I look back, but what I wanted was a DNA sample of an animal that was only showing up on camera trap every so often, every week or so, and then during the winter disappeared completely. We wanted that sample that we could show the origin of the animal. So we wanted to know whether or not it was of Scottish origin, which would have meant it was from the haplotype A. So that's the geographic family type or genetic type. What we hoped is that we'd find it would actually be haplotype I, which would have been the English-Welsh genetic type of pine marten. But those were presumed extinct, and the only reason that we even know they existed is because of a hair sample tested from a museum specimen almost 100 years ago now. And there's also haplotype P over in Ireland. Across Europe there's lots of other different haplotypes where you've got pine martens too. But of course in the UK, pine martens can cover big distances. There's always a chance that those Scottish and English genetic types may have just crossed paths anyway naturally. There's nothing to stop them coming over the borders. So I started to wonder whether or not it would ever even prove that the pine martens were here of their own accord, or whether or not they may have been dropped off from Scotland at some point in the not so recent past. All right, this bit's a little bit gross, but some of my colleagues know exactly what I'm going to cover about scat and poo, because it's all I talk about when I'm in the office, unfortunately. And this is a typical pine marten poo. It's twisty, quite shiny looking when it's fresh, and it looks pretty disgusting, but it can be confused with things like fox scat and polecat poo. So there's only one way to find out if you've got a pine marten dropping, and that is to give it a sniff. So we used to go out looking for the pine marten scats. People would collect things up on spatulas and stick them in front of me. I'd give them a sniff, and if they didn't smell sweet, or some people say like damp hay or the odour of Parma violet sweets, it's probably not going to be a pine marten. It's probably going to be something like a fox or a polecat. But I sniffed a lot of scats during that time and didn't come across anything that smelled remotely pleasant. But people came from all over the place, and I apologise if Natalie, Phil, or anybody else that featured in this video is watching now. But and Paul here as well. Paul came all the way across from the other side of Staffordshire just to get his nose into some pine marten scat. And Katie and Ben there came across from Birmingham. So you can see we've got some very dedicated people. And of course Paul right there coming up from Worcestershire. So people, again, a huge amount of interest coming from all over the place to get involved. And it didn't really seem that glamorous. Now I don't want to belittle their skills at finding scats, but the volunteers weren't that productive at finding scats. Even I'm not particularly great at finding scats. Pine marten scats are really difficult to find unless there's a lot of them, and they're along trails or in pronounced spots on tree stumps and on rocky outcrops. So what we also tried was a conservation scat search. So using a lovely sniffer dog called Luna. Luna's trained purely to detect pine marten scat, and her handler Louise Wilson has done a brilliant job at training Luna and taking her out to detect pine martens all over the UK. And Luna could find scats much quicker than me and my volunteers. She could get onto trails and show where pine martens may have been scent marking, but she also did find us 4 potentially positive pine marten scats, which I would then bag up, get a grid reference marked onto there and sent it off for analysis. But sadly, none of those that Luna found yielded any DNA, and there's a good chance that that's because they were too old for there to be any viable DNA left in those scats. But it seemed that Luna was definitely detecting something that the lab equipment wasn't detecting, potentially. Just to show how effective Luna was, this is a pine marten in Shropshire scent marking on a fallen tree over a brook, and over a month later, after it's rained, it's also been incredibly windy weather. That scent is still there, and Luna's picked it up despite it being a good metre or so off the ground. So Luna was a wise investment, and it's well worth using Luna if we don't find scats, but to actually find out where the pine marten trails might be. Now, what I should mention is the strangeness when it comes to habitat in South Shropshire. So we never anticipated pine martens being able to do well in South Shropshire, because a lot of the woodland down that way is actually quite young. A lot of it was felled pre-war during the First and Second World Wars, and then replanted. So a lot of these big old trees aren't quite old enough to have hollows and the denning options. So pine martens like a good old hollow trees that they can move into to rear their young and to tuck themselves away from the weather. Where there's not hollow trees, we can put in den boxes, and I was very kindly accompanied by John Martin and Johnny Burks the first year after we discovered the martens, and they helped put these den boxes up, as you can see, about 15 feet or so up trees. And that's just to offer the pine martens somewhere to safely get off the ground to rest or to rear their young, as I mentioned, and out of the reach of things like foxes. The hope was that the pine marten would also go in and leave us a hair sample. But what also happens in Shropshire, we've got lots of grey squirrels. So where we did put den boxes up with cameras on, within hours of putting the den boxes up, we'd often find that the camera traps recorded grey squirrels moving in straight away. So that poor pine martens weren't getting a look in. But that could also be an interesting point. We're still not too sure if pine martens here are predating grey squirrels. I'm sure they are. There's lots of grey squirrels around for them, and pine martens definitely have an impact on grey squirrels in other parts of the UK. But we're still looking for evidence that the pine martens may keep the grey squirrel population in check. And that's where the den boxes, we're hoping by monitoring the den boxes, we'll see if any pine martens go sniffing around the den boxes the squirrels are using. So getting away from the DNA and the den boxes, one of the other points I mentioned earlier was getting the individuals, so we could count how many pine martens there were out there in the Shropshire Hills area. And to do that, I needed to get the chest bib. So each pine marten has a very distinctive chest bib pattern. And I devised this tunnel, which I took up to Scotland. And you can see in Scotland, there's lots of pine martens. And they're very obliging. They come straight into the tunnel and show their chest bib there. So you can see from that video clip, pine marten has just proudly shown his chest bib. And we can see his pattern. Take a freeze frame of that and match it against other pine martens. By far the easiest way to tell the different individuals apart. So buoyed by that experiment up in Scotland, I brought the tunnel back, set it up on the ground in Shropshire, and of course before a pine marten could get anywhere near it, Mr. Badger got there first. And I won't tell you what the badger did, but the tunnel was pretty much wrecked after that badger had finished with it. It stank and no other wildlife would go anywhere near it, so it took a bit of washing off. So I cleaned off the badger mess that had been kindly left for us, and decided to move it up a tree out of reach of badgers, but of course still within reach of pine martens. And when you do that, of course, you get Mr. and Mrs. Owl coming to have a look instead. So the tunnel cam was attracting lots of really great wildlife, but not necessarily the wildlife that I was after. Although I get to show this stuff at talks now, so it's not all bad news. At the same time, we had got pine martens still showing up on camera traps in other parts of the woodland, well away from the tunnel. Pine martens here weren't going for the bait, so we were using things like honey and peanut butter. Not once did a pine marten in Shropshire that I've recorded yet go anywhere near any peanut butter or honey. They just seem to either check the camera trap out because they're inquisitive, another trait of the mustelid family, or it's just a case of the camera trap being in just the right place at the right time. In 2017 we had our first daylight clips of what appeared to be a young male pine marten, so that this was a good promising sign that pine martens had bred in South Shropshire, which was great news. But it was also really great news to see these pine martens in Shropshire coexisting with their other mustelid cousins, so that things like badgers showing up in the same area. And the smaller member of the mustelid family, distinguishable with the black tail tip, is the stoat. So it's just great stuff to see all of these pretty elusive animals showing up right here in Shropshire. And it's only thanks to the camera traps that we even know that they're all about. And just to give you an idea of how clever pine martens are, they do sometimes outwit me, but you may have noticed from the previous clip of a pine marten it was running away from the camera trap and not showing his bib. So a couple of years later I thought I'll catch the pine marten out this time, move the camera trap to the other end of the branch, and of course the clever pine marten showed up from the other side instead. But what we did get there, if I slow it down, is just a side profile of that pine marten bib, and we can see a couple of distinguishable features there that would enable me to track that marten or plot it against other bibs that I've recorded on camera trap. And that this was another individual marten, a big large male, and I'm just going to play that again because I just want everybody to remember the size of that. So you can see the size of the marten there. Again, in the original woodland we found martens, and another big male passing through. So that was at the time we think about the 7th pine marten that we detected on camera trap. At the same spot we've also got the other member of the mustelid family, the polecat, and you can see how much bigger a pine marten is than a polecat. So that this polecat probably about a third shorter than the pine marten. But again, really exciting that we're able to view both members, both cohabiting the same patch of woodland. Now the young one that showed up on the tree branch that I mentioned, the pretty obvious bib pattern, also then started to show up the following year, and he was using this trail quite regularly. But what you'll notice there, that he did some scent marking that didn't involve leaving a scat. So this pine marten has just basically left a scent deposit with his scent glands, which is just pressed to the ground. That's quite unusual because in Scotland and in other parts of Europe where there's a lot of pine martens tend to always use their droppings for lots of reasons, for attracting males and mates in, for basically plotting their routes around their own territories, and of course for using as territorial markers to keep off other pine martens. This pine marten doesn't seem to be leaving us any scat whatsoever, which explains why it was so difficult going back a few years as to why we weren't finding scat anywhere. The martens have showed up pretty much everywhere along the Clun Valley that I've put camera traps out. So I've had camera traps out on big private bits of woodland. But I've also tried to venture a bit further afield and now detected, in 2018 we got our first pine martens up towards Church Stretton, and that actually lined up nicely with quite a reliable sighting of a pine marten that we had in Marshbrook back in 1997. So that indicated that maybe those big forestry plantations at the south end of the Long Min may have been suitable for pine martens, and that there may have been a limited population in there already. Over the last year, though, we've now recorded pine martens right over towards Bishop's Castle too, and further north of Lyddham. So they seem to be across the wider landscape, but not in huge numbers. So some people do worry that if there's pine martens out there, they may have an impact on things like your ground nesting birds and songbirds, because they're, as I mentioned before, they're opportunists. They will predate some species. They will go for birds every so often, but they have a very varied diet, so they'll go also for your herbal vegetation, fruits and berries, and nuts as well. So they don't necessarily have a huge impact on the other animals living in the same ecological system as themselves. Now I'm going to just flick on to show you that it's not always good news. I've had camera traps out all over South Shropshire now for quite a few years, and I've been very lucky, touch wood, not to have any camera traps stolen yet. But I've had a few acts of vandalism, and you'd assume that this was probably a person, but if you just watch it for long enough, you see the culprit eventually. And it's quite terrifying watching this back when I started to go through all the footage from the SD card, having picked up the camera trap. Found it lying on the floor, and I found it was actually a very feisty, testosterone-fueled roe deer who tried to smash the camera trap up, left it lying on the floor, where it then recorded endless clips of other deer, squirrels, and also muntjac deer going past. So sometimes the wildlife does sabotage my efforts to monitor the pine martens, and that of course would have an impact on the number of pine marten records that I get in a year. But the pine martens do sometimes show up randomly, where I'll just put out some bait there. There's some that's actually a tin of sardines hanging off a tree. The pine marten just happened to be going along that track and didn't even stop to sniff at the sardines. But what they have started to stop at is the latest experiment has been with a piece of plumbing pipe with a T-bend on the top, and what we do is put some like peanut scent in there, and mice and squirrels can't eat it, which is what happens generally when I put anything out that's sweet smelling, peanut butter or jam. Squirrels and mice get there first. Now, it had been 2 weeks before a pine marten had actually found this tube that was full of bait. Generally the bait would be gone within about 2 or 3 hours of me putting the camera trap out and the food out, thanks to the grey squirrels. So this seemed to be quite an effective way of getting the pine martens to stand up and hopefully show their bibs. But at the same time, another site where 3.5 years ago, Luna, the sniffer dog, had detected a marten going across this branch. There'd been no activity of a pine marten there for quite a long period, but then all of a sudden this marten started showing up. Not just once, but pretty much every 3 weeks again, following the same branch on a trail and scent marking. But very much unpredictable behaviour, and it's quite interesting to note there that pine marten's got a winter coat. So the winter coat is much thicker than the summer coat, which does make the martens look a bit like bigger animals actually during the winter. And this was the closest we got to getting a pine marten moving to a den box that had actually blown out of a tree during some storms. Just very, very briefly had a pine marten investigate it, and I always wonder what would have happened if the wind hadn't blown that den box out of the tree. We may have got a pine marten moving for the first time. And just to show how good camera traps are getting now, so this is a Browning camera trap. It's got an interesting name that I can't remember, but it's something along the lines of Recon Pro. And the camera traps now actually, they don't drown out the chest bib like a lot of the earlier camera traps did, so we're getting much more reliable data from the chest bib patterns thanks to the advances in camera trap technology. This year you can see that we've put out some more of our I don't even know what to call them, our bait tubes, and again a pine marten's just stopped to check it out there. And at another site, this was by far our best clip, and this is just from last month. The pine marten just standing up and giving us a nice clip of his bib there. So often we can try all kinds of complicated things, but it's sometimes in nature we find that it's the most simple things that are most effective. And this is a clip actually just from last week, so this is an exclusive clip that I've tried not to share it on social media, so I could show everybody tonight. But this is a marten hanging around in a new area that we'd only put the camera trap out a few weeks before, and it's already recorded this marten passing through every 3 or 4 days. So it's become our most effective camera trapping location, and I'm hoping that we'll get some more footage from there on the next checks, which will probably be next week now. But what is interesting here is this is actually a really thin strip of woodland that just happens to be a link between one big patch of oak woodland and one big huge patch, hundreds of acres of pine plantation. And I put that camera trap in there speculatively just to see if anything might be using it as a corridor. And when I talk about a corridor, it's not like a hospital corridor. We're talking about a natural corridor or a green corridor that acts as a nice habitat link across the landscape. And so to demonstrate this, I've done this. I think you'll all be very impressed with my artistic prowess when it comes to using Photoshop and Publisher. These are forests, and this is a very simple depiction of a landscape that isn't particularly well connected. So South Shropshire, lots of hill farms and cultivated land, and not a lot of connectivity between the woodlands. In some parts of the UK it's even worse. There's just very, very isolated patches of woodland, which, as you can see from these, they're almost like islands of woodland. Now, martens and other animals like dormice too, they need that connectivity, so they need good quality hedgerows and stretches of cover that they can move amongst those smaller patches of woodland. Now, so you can see there it's quite difficult. The pine marten in the woodland over to the left is going to have to cross a lot of open land, which isn't preferable to a pine marten if he wants to get to another patch of woodland in search of a mate or somewhere safe to den up. So this is what we'd be aiming for. We want to try and link that with these patches of woodland so that the pine martens can move from bit of woodland to woodland and move around fairly undetected, and obviously be much safer. There's all kinds of this is very, very ambitious, but there's already plans in place for the March area in South Shropshire to undergo some work to increase the forestry cover, and hopefully over the next few years the forestry cover is going to increase from about 7% up to 17%. So this isn't just for pine martens. Of course, there's the climate change need. People realise there's the importance of trees in absorbing CO2 and combating climate change. And if planting woodland is good for us, it's also going to really benefit the wildlife, such as the pine martens, which could easily become the iconic or poster boy species of this woodland regeneration. So hopefully, because we've found these martens down in South Shropshire, we'll be able to start expanding our woodland cover from what you can see now. We've already got quite good woodland cover down in South Shropshire and stretching into Herefordshire. but there's also lots of opportunity. So our data and conservation officer Joe's very kindly put these maps together, showing where there's been areas of opportunity mapped by the Environment Agency. And the green patches are patches of existing woodland, and many of those that we know that there's pine martens in now. And those pink areas represent areas of opportunity. So that's land that could be planted up with woodland again. Because, of course, there's a huge interest, despite what's happening now with the crisis situation, there's still a need to look at the climate crisis, and there's still a huge interest in planting trees where possible. But we don't just want to plant trees anywhere, and that's why we've also listed the priority habitat. What we don't want to be doing is planting trees on nice heathland or improved grasslands and really nice other habitats that are already in decline themselves. So we've also mapped out where those areas are that we shouldn't be encouraging people to plant trees. But you can see that there's a huge vision for South Shropshire, going right the way across into Rediscovering in Wales and into Herefordshire, to start linking up all of this brilliant habitat, which is only going to benefit the pine martens, and of course it will benefit us in the long run too. And hopefully for the martens that we've got, the population that we've got down in South Shropshire, which I'll introduce as best as I can through camera trap still shots, that the future is going to be much brighter. It's going to be much easier for them to move around, meet up, and of course their breeding success rate is going to be much better if they're able to move around safely without being detected, or of course without having to venture out across open patches of farmland. So just to give you an idea of the bib patterns that we've collected over the years, so that was one back in 2015 with a spot pattern, another really small looking marten there, another patch of woodland down towards the Herefordshire border. Of course the original marten that we got had a really nice clean throat bib, no patches on there whatsoever. This marten looked very, very similar to the marten over on the left-hand side, but this was another marten recorded at a site several miles away from where that marten was, pretty much at the same time, so two marten bibs look very similar. And just to flick through, we've got all of these different bibs, this from this year, another one from this year, and this pine marten that showed up most recently, well, it was recently as February this year, that we hadn't detected before. So at the moment it looks like we've got between 13 and 15 different individuals on camera, which sounds like a good number, but there needs to be much more, a much bigger population of pine martens to make that population viable. They're dependent on the linked good quality woodland habitat as well to be able to breed and to find all the food they need. And there is still a bit of work to do, but obviously, as I've just laid out there are plans, and as ambitious they are, it's going to be great news for things like ecotourism. There's actually a huge interest in people trying to see wildlife as part of their holidays, so why not come to Shropshire and be lucky enough to encounter these pine martens in what we thought was pretty decent habitat as it is, but just having something like a pine marten around just makes that woodland seem even more special. Now you can see that we've already got 21 records of pine martens on camera trap in 2020. I haven't been able to check all the camera traps as regularly as I would have liked over the last few weeks, but hopefully we'll be able to up the ante as the restrictions start to lift. So the future's looking pretty good. It's certainly good for me because it means that I get to spend a bit more time playing out, looking at camera traps, but it's also really exciting to know that there's definitely pine martens out there, and well, long may it continue. So thank you all for listening to the first YouTube live talk. There's quite a few comments which I was going to go through to see if there were any questions, but if anybody does have questions you'd like to ask, feel free to type them in, and I will try to answer any as quickly as I can. At the moment it looks like there's been, it's great to see there's been lots of conversations happening. There is a comment there from Ian at the Beaver Trust. Hi Ian. to talk about reintroductions how they work out. What we often find with the population that we've been monitoring is that there's sometimes a bit of a misinterpretation of the ones that we've been monitoring, and it's assumed they were actually originating from the Vincent Wildlife Trust translocation of pine martens from Scotland to Wales in 2015, which was in August. Now, we actually started monitoring the pine martens and we discovered them on camera trap down in South Shropshire in July 2015, just prior to there being any releases, which is why I was so keen to find out if somebody else had already taken things into their own hands and started to release them anyway. But to be honest, we just don't know. There's a possibility that people have illegally translocated martens down from Scotland at some point in the past, but there's also a possibility that based on anecdotal evidence there may have already been martens still clinging on in some of the most remote stretches of woodland in South Shropshire. But we don't know, but all we can now do is celebrate the fact that they're here and make sure that we don't lose them. So I've got a question from Terry. Can I make the pipe post upright from rough timber to attempt to get some hair for DNA? Well, what we've done now, Ian, because they've obviously been pretty reliable at attracting the martens in, I've actually been putting a little piece of like double-sided carpet tape on around the base. So if a pine marten comes up and stands up against the tube, it should pick up a hair sample. So I'm hoping that will be the case. Pine martens are pretty unpredictable. I fully expect that a pine marten won't go near one of those tubes if it's got carpet tape on, but hopefully we'll be able to report back in a few months' time. Okay, I've got another question here from South Wales. Any martens in the Wye Valley? Well, I would say there has been a re-release over the last 2 years down in the Forest of Dean, which has been a joint project between Vincent Wildlife Trust and Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust with some input from Forestry England, and they released about 35 or so pine martens in the Forest of Dean, which will have spread out a little bit, and I would say that they will have now ended up in the Wye Valley. So I think there probably are now pine martens over in the Wye Valley, yes. And Wire Forest is another option. So Emma Tipton there has mentioned the Wire Forest. Now we haven't got camera traps out in the Wire Forest. We're trying to cover quite a big area, but we do get anecdotal sightings of pine martens not far from the Wire Forest down at the Clee Hills area and down towards Bewdley. So what we really need is somebody to possibly get a few of their own camera traps and start putting them out just along the forest boundaries down there too. So you never know. I never say never. And another question from Midlands Birder there. Any plans on expanding the camera trap project into the south-east of the county? I think I've just touched on that there. It is something that I'm really keen to do, but one of the sticking points really is having the time to cover such a big geographical region, and I get to spend about a day or half a day a week when I can fit it in checking the cameras, and that's why it's really all about having more people volunteer. So if people are interested in volunteering, they can contact me, look me up on the Shropshire Wildlife Trust website as well, where you can read all about the project. So you could even become a member if you're not already a member of Shropshire Wildlife Trust, and you can contact me directly. So if people are keen to get involved, please feel free to give me a shout. Another question there from Chris Ronaldson. Hi Chris, we've read in an old book that they live in underground burrows. Is this true? Interesting point is that we refer to pine martens being arboreal and living in dens well off the ground, but in places that I've spoken to doing projects over in Europe, a lot of their pine martens do den in burrows, old disused badger sets, and even disused fox earths. So I think that there is, if there's limited denning potential or areas for pine martens to live up in trees, they're very adaptable, so they'll go for those ground-based burrow systems instead. And got a comment there from H Plant. Sorry, I can only see H Plants, but so I'll call you H for now. Natural England and Forestry Commissioner Worcestershire Wildlife Trust may be up for supporting camera traps in the wire forest. Yeah, that's something that we will definitely hope to do later this year, as soon as things start lifting. So yeah, fingers crossed. Richard Summers has mentioned his pine marten sighting down. I've spoken to Richard before, and Richard was lucky enough to see a pine marten down on the edge of Ludlow. Now, I haven't mentioned the pine martens even further south because we don't know enough about the ones around the Ludlow area. So we have got them show up not far from Ludlow, just into the border with Herefordshire, but at the moment, we haven't got full permission to continue with the monitoring in that area, and of course it's a time restriction, so there will be more plans to do some more monitoring, and hopefully we've got some great people down in the Ludlow branch, and Friends of Wycliffe Common. Friends of Wycliffe have also got their own camera trap, as have the local branch, which I'm hoping may detect a pine marten or two for us. The question from Gavin: I know pine martens are being filmed in the New Forest. Is that likely to be a reintroduction? In the New Forest, there's been some rumours of escapees from captive rearing programmes, so there are collections in captivity. I very much doubt that they've been in the New Forest. The New Forest is quite heavily populated now, and it is very busy, and I'm sure that people would have been seeing pine martens for a long time down there, but it would seem they're probably escapees from collections rather than a natural population. Well, I think we've just a quick note from Whitchurch branch. Hello, Whitchurch branch, and it should have been their branch meeting tonight, so I'm glad that we coincided this talk with the branch meeting, because of course our branches are very active normally, but also very frustrated at the moment they can't have their regular meetings. So I'm glad that we're able to do this and at least do something that allows us to get together and speak about things that we're all passionate about. So at least we can still do this through the powers of technology. And one more question, I think, before we knock off, and that's from Karen Mitchell. How big are pine marten territories? Well, they vary quite a lot, Karen. It all depends on the abundance of prey. It depends on the amount of connected woodland and the quality of the woodland as well. So in good quality habitat, a pine marten might only have a small territory of maybe 6 kilometres square, maybe as big for a male, 10 kilometres square. But when they're in areas where the habitat's very fragmented and they've just got little patches of woodland that are maybe just a handful of acres, they're much more likely to be inhabiting a territory probably well up over 20 kilometres square, so that they can cover huge distances. Oh, I have to just take this question about grey squirrels. There's a question here, have I noticed any effects on the grey squirrels from the pine martens? At the moment, no. I'd like to say that I've got loads of camera trap footage of pine martens venturing along with grey squirrels in their mouths, but at the moment there's been no sign of it. But of course these are really difficult to monitor animals, and we're not really seeing a huge amount of their behaviour down in Shropshire. All we know is that they're there because of the camera traps. They're not leaving us physical evidence that they're there. We're just really keeping our fingers crossed that the pine martens get used to the camera traps. We've got more camera traps out that are more reliable, and they may start acting in front of the camera traps a bit more, so we can learn more about them. Right, so I'm going to leave it there now. It's been an hour. There's been no technical glitches that I can note, so everything's gone really well. So thanks everybody for joining me. And as I say, if you want to keep in touch, just drop me an email, or you can obviously contact me through the Shropshire Wildlife Trust website. Okay, thank you very much.